The Kyle Pitts trade rumors might be dead, but it doesn't mean the Falcons won't need him to come alive this year in order to reach the playoffs.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. I've been podcasting for a decade and a half. And I appreciate each and every one of you, whether you've been listening to this podcast for a decade and a half or today is your first episode. I appreciate each and every one of you that is an everydayer that makes this podcast your first listen. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are talking about the thing that we've been putting on for weeks, if not months, which is we're talking all about Kyle Pitts. And this comes from a tweet from Jordan Schultz, NFL Insider, on Friday, in which he said, sources, multiple teams have reached out to the Falcons about the availability of tight end Kyle Pitts. Nothing is imminent. Atlanta would prefer to keep him, but I'm told it would take at least a day 2 pick to even spark serious talks. So shout out to Jordan Schultz for talking about a thing that we've been talking about it. Well, we haven't been talking about it for the last 3 or 4 months, but we're talking about 3 or 4 months ago. This isn't new information, guys. Don't sit here and act like this. Don't be brand new and act like this is new information. It's like, oh, well, Kyle Pitts trade is imminent. No. This has been the same situation that we spent most of January and February talking about. We talked about then how the Falcons were likely looking for hopefully a 3rd round pick to get Kyle Pitts, right? It's just the reason why are they talking about it now, right? It's because there's nothing else to talk about. Right, you go watch these, NFL Network and whatnot. They're talking about who showed up for voluntary workouts and who didn't show up for, and what does it mean, and all this. Like they have literally nothing else to talk about. And so, with the Jonnu Smith trade rumor coming around, I'm sure the Jordan Schultzes of the world were reaching out to their various sources and being like, who else could be available? And it's like, oh, Kyle Pitts might be available. Speaking of tight ends, and it's like, yeah, Kyle Pitts has been available for 4 months. This ain't nothing new. So, we talked about it back then, 4 months ago. And we talked about the potential for Kyle Pitts having a robust trade market back in early February or mid to late February before the combine, in contrast to what one of our guests, Josh Kendall of The Athletic, said, where he didn't think there was going to be much of a trade market. Josh was once again right on that one, while I was wrong on that one. And basically the idea back then was, hey, for one of these teams that's not going to get Colston Loveland in round 1 or Tyler Warren in round 1, maybe they'll circle back and say, hey, let's get Kyle Pitts, right, in a contract year. And that didn't quite work out. And I think one of the reasons why we haven't talked about Kyle Pitts really since that, February 22nd or whenever that episode was when we talked about his trade market was because the trade market changed, right? At that time, it seemed like Kyle Pitts was going to be the prize. But then we found out during Combine Week that the Raiders are also shopping Michael Mayer. Right. We found out during free agency that the Eagles were open for people to trade for Dallas Goedert. And now you have this past week, Jonnu Smith reports about him potentially being on the trade block. And so essentially we needed scarcity when it came to the tight end market for someone to come in and give up the price that the Falcons were looking for back then, which again, we thought was a 3rd round pick, and what Jordan Schultz and everybody else is saying, suggesting a similar sort of price tag, right? Unfortunately, there's too much supply when it comes to the tight ends this offseason and just not enough demand. And that's not likely to change in the coming months. And so that's why I continue to say, hey guys, don't sit here and think something new is happening, something brand new. Oh, the wheels are moving, right? Again, I'm not going to get into it on today's episode, but one of my biggest frustrations with social media when it comes to coverage of this team and how fans react to what they see on social media is that they overreact to the most recent piece of information that they did and somehow think, hey, a Kyle Pitts trade is imminent now because Jordan Schultz tweeted about it, and that's the most recent tweet about the Falcons from an NFL insider, even though nothing has changed in 4 months. But we will see if something changes over the next 4 months, right, over the summer, or as we push towards the trade deadline, which is on November 4th this year, that, similar to Kirk Cousins, maybe there's an injury that will force a team to up their offer, up that demand for a tight end like Kyle Pitts. Maybe the Falcons come down on their demands in the lead up to the trade deadline, or a team is willing to go up their demands in the lead up to that November 4th trade deadline. We'll have to sort of see, but there's really no reason to sort of speculate on a Kyle Pitts trade today any more than you have been speculating about a Kyle Pitts trade 3-4 months ago. And there's less reason now, frankly, because the market has kind of dictated to you that teams aren't willing to meet the various prices that teams are looking for. Other teams, including the Falcons, are looking for. So there's less reason to speculate on a Kyle Pitts trade. And so unless something changes in that regard, and there's only a handful of teams that I think would even seriously consider Kyle Pitts at this stage in the offseason, as opposed to where we were in February before any moves were made, basically like Tennessee and maybe Dallas, in my humble opinion, that would actually be willing to overpay for a player like Kyle Pitts. But we will see on that front. But when we talk about what could change for Kyle Pitts, the focus is not on a trade. The focus is on, can the Falcons get more out of Kyle Pitts this upcoming season? Because frankly, I don't think this team makes the playoffs if they don't get more out of Kyle Pitts than they got a year ago. And I'll explain why as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So as a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that's going to work just as hard as you do. And that's where LinkedIn comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn's going to clock in, and they're going to make it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. So when you post your job, LinkedIn's going to have that new feature that's going to help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip: add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture, and you're going to double the reach to qualified candidates. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So Kyle Pitts is a necessary component of this Falcons offense, because we just look back through that 6 week span from week 5 to week 10, where the Falcons were tied for the second most explosive plays in the NFL during that 6-game stretch behind Baltimore. They were tied with Washington in second place, generating 30 explosive plays over those 6 weeks. And that was also, not coincidentally, the best stretch of the season from a record standpoint, and their best stretch of the season when it came to scoring points, right? Those two things are related. Like, the more points you score, the more chances, the higher your probability of winning games, especially when you're dealing with the Atlanta Falcons defense, because Lord knows we are not winning 17-14 games like that. But it's not a coincidence that during that 6-game stretch, that was also the stretch of games where Kyle Pitts was also most involved in the offense. He accounted for 17% of those explosive plays that they had during that stretch. The rest of the season, it was 5% of the Falcons' explosive plays, right? You also look at how many targets he was getting during that stretch of the season. 15.8% of the Falcons' passing attempts went to Kyle Pitts. The rest of the year, that was 11.7%. And you compare that. I went and looked up the top 33 tight ends in the NFL last year in terms of target share. All the guys that had 49 or more targets last year, 33 of him. And that 15.8% that Kyle Pitts had during that 6-game stretch would have ranked 16th in the NFL, right behind Sam Laporta at 16.8% and right ahead of Pat Freiermuth at 15.6%. So smack dab in the middle among those top 33 tight ends. And then you compare that to the 11.7% target share that he had for the rest of the season outside of that 6-game stretch. That would have ranked 28th in the NFL among the 33 tight ends, just behind Jawan Johnson's 12% and just ahead of Austin Hooper's 11.1%. And the interesting thing about those two guys is those two guys were technically the number 2 tight end in a 2 tight end offense. That Johnson was the pass catcher in his duo with Foster Moreau in New Orleans, and Austin Hooper was more of the blocker, with Hunter Henry being the pass catcher in that duo. And so, that's kind of telling you that Kyle Pitts was basically being used like a number 2 tight end would be used in an offense that wasn't using 2 tight ends, which is what the Falcons were not, an offense that used 2 tight ends all that often outside of 3 games last year, right? And so for me, basically what I'm sitting here saying is like that 15.8% that we saw during that 6-game stretch where this Falcons offense was humming, they were explosive, they were winning games. That was the stretch of games that was during the month of October, right? That should be the norm throughout the entire season. We should get that for at least an entire season. At least 15, 16% of the Falcons targets are going to Kyle Pitts. Again, that's down from what it was in the Arthur Smith years when that number was like in the 20 percentile. No one's pushing for that, right? No one's expecting Kyle Pitts to be the featured weapon in the offense like he was during those Arthur Smith years, right? You know, and that's what 16% of the targets could potentially be. And so, when we translate what 16% of the targets could be in this version of the Falcons offense, right? And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago in sort of talking about, Kirk Cousins was on pace for like 570 targets last year had he not been benched. And so if we just assume Michael Penix is going to throw the ball just as much, 570 targets, about 16% of 570 targets would be about 91 targets for Kyle Pitts, right? He had 74 last year. That's 17 more targets this year. That's one more target per game, and that's a healthy number for Kyle Pitts. We're not talking about some huge chunk of the offense that the Falcons have to carve out for Kyle Pitts in order to get to an acceptable number, right? Like the fact that you can't come up with one more target, scheme up one more target for Kyle Pitts. I mean, it could be as easy as a screen pass, which the Falcons ran 0 tight end screens last year. They were the only team in the NFL that did not run a single tight end screen last year. And I bring that up because, the Falcons like to zig when other teams like to zag. And oftentimes the way that the Falcons zig doesn't make a ton of sense when it comes to like, why are you the only team that's not running a tight end screens last year? But, we know that Kyle Pitts is not going to be the featured weapon in this offense, right? We know that when defensive coordinators are looking at this Falcons offense, they're looking at the big three in terms of what are the priorities in terms of what they're game planning to be, right? Bijan Robinson in the run game is number 1. Drake London is number 2 as their Falcons number 1 wide receiver, and Darnell Mooney is number 3 as their number 2 wide receiver. Basically, what I'm sitting here saying, guys, is Kyle Pitts should be the fourth option, right? It should be a big 3 plus Kyle Pitts, right? I'm not even going to say a big 4. I'm just saying a big 3 plus Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts should be number 4. Unfortunately, too often, Ray McCloud has been the number 4 guy in the offense. And to me, that's making it too easy on defensive coordinators, right? That they don't have to spend here devoting really much of any time during the week game plan trying to figure out how we stop this 6'6", 240-pound tight end with 4.4 speed. Instead, they're like, oh, how do we stop this 5'9", 190-pound wide receiver with 4.4 speed that basically is ideally a number 4 wide receiver, not a number 3 wide receiver? You're just making it easier on defensive coordinators. You're challenging defenses if you can find ways to make Kyle Pitts at least a feature weapon. It's about the idea when we talk about Michael Penix and his arm talent. It's forcing defenses to defend every blade of grass. It is much harder to defend the entire field and all of the Falcons receivers than it is to just defend 2 of them, right? Which is too often the case with the Atlanta Falcons last year, and due to the limited arm strength of the former quarterback and whatnot. And so basically what I'm sitting here asking is Kyle Pitts just needs to be your trump card, right? Because frankly, when we face good defenses, which the Falcons struggled against, those playoff caliber defenses that are top 10, top 12 units, right? And again, I don't think this is a coincidence why the Falcons struggled against those teams, right? But good defenses are generally going to be able to stop the big 3, right? They're going to be able to stop the run, right? Playoff caliber defenses generally are able to stop the run, and usually they're going to have more than 2 corners that are going to be able to keep your wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 in check. And so the question is going to be, you as an offense, what else do you have when those playoff caliber defenses, are able to do that? And that's when you throw down the trump card that is Kyle Pitts, and you take this thing to Boston, right? If you understand the card playing parlance that I'm using, right? And to me, that's going to represent far more challenges for defensive coordinators and far more challenges for playoff caliber defenses, because not everybody has a guy that they can stick on a tight end the caliber of Kyle Pitts. Everybody's got a functional nickel cornerback. That guy's going to have no problem stopping Ray McCloud. And again, it sounds like I'm a Ray hater to a lot of folks. My opinion of Ray has basically been unchanged for 9 months, right? It feels like everybody else just rides this roller coaster when it comes to Ray, right? Like in August, I was higher on Ray than most people were because I think everybody was on their Rondale Moore BS at that point in time, right? And then in season, I was lower on Ray because I think a lot of people, for all the reasons I'm talking about today, because I'm like, why are we featuring Ray McCloud? And everybody's like, Ray's doing great, and Kyle Pitts is the one that sucks. And I'm like, sure, guys. And then now in the offseason, it feels like a lot of people have turned on Ray And they're like, we got to upgrade that number 3 wide receiver spot. And as I said, Ray is a functional number 3, but ideally a number 4, right? And that's basically been the opinion I've maintained from the jump. All right. And the Falcons need to get more out of that, 4th option in their offense. But instead of focusing on trying to upgrade the number 3 wide receiver, just use the resources that you already have and get more out of Kyle Pitts. That's what I'm talking about. Like, we got to get more out of this talented player that we have that has underachieved, no doubt about it. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why he has underachieved. But the solution to your problem, in my humble opinion, is staring you in the face. You don't have to sit here and look around while Kyle Pitts is staring you in the face, being like, where do we get more impact out of our passing game with Michael Penix and whatnot? And so, will the switch to Michael Penix lead to more success out of Kyle Pitts? There's hope for that. We'll break that down as we continue today's episode, but I'll also explain why I don't think it's as much of a Michael Penix or a Kyle Pitts issue as much as it is a Zac Robinson issue. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So we know that there's been a lot of turnover at the quarterback position during these last 4+ years that Kyle Pitts has been here. Michael Penix will basically be the 6th quarterback that Kyle Pitts has been asked and expected to work with during his time in Atlanta. And of course, the question is going to be, will Kyle Pitts benefit from this 6th quarterback? Will this be the solution to the Falcons' problems, right? We're very optimistic about Michael Penix's future here in Atlanta. We like to pump all day. But I sit here and I ask, to answer that question, is Penix going to be the one to get the most out of Kyle Pitts? Possibly, but I don't think it's really about the quarterback. And now in 2022, it certainly was about the quarterback, because Kyle Pitts was mostly a vertical threat in that offense, and the Falcons in Marcus Mariota had the worst vertical passer in the NFL that season, right? And, I can't recall the exact figure that we talked about in the lead up to that 23 offseason, but I want to say that the number in terms of if Marcus Mariota was just a league average vertical passer, there was like 300 yards left on the field just on Kyle Pitts targets because of those missed deep balls. And that's, fueled a lot of our Desmond Ridder hype. And for the most part, you saw a bounce back and an improvement in those deep passing numbers in 23. Under Ridder, not to the degree that we hoped it would be, but still was, decent compared. And then those numbers again dipped this past season. And so in theory, I can understand why people are hopeful, particularly with Penix under center, given his propensity to hit the deep ball, which is something we focus on quite a bit on this podcast over the last month, that's going to lead to greater success. And we're hoping that those two guys can build a strong rapport. And you're seeing and hearing instances where Penix and Pitts are not only working together in the offseason, running routes and throwing, passes, but hanging out together. And you're hoping that's going to benefit and build that stronger rapport. And again, will that help? Sure, it's possible. But I don't think that's going to solve the problem, because I think ultimately it's less about that rapport and between those two quarterbacks, because it's hard to build that rapport when the routes that Kyle Pitts is being asked to run, aren't really designed to build trust, right? Like, a lot of the routes that Kyle Pitts runs are like clear outs and checkdowns. And right. And those aren't necessarily routes that are really designed to build trust and timing. Whereas it's like, okay, my first 2-3 reads aren't open. I'm going to check it down to Kyle Pitts. And then he's not in the progression because he's just running a vertical clear out for the player that is in the progression. And so that hurts, I think, some of the timing and rapport that he was supposed to build with Kirk Cousins, but never really developed because he wasn't consistently running the types of routes that were doing that. And right. And looking at, websites like ftnfantasy.com, and they sort of break down how many targets guys are getting based off of their routes. And you look at, hitches, curls, and quick outs were the bulk of Kyle Pitts' targets last year. About 49% of his targets last year were one of those routes. Then about 27% of his targets were the vertical stuff, the go routes, the wheels, the corners, the posts that have been the norm for Kyle Pitts over the years. And then about 22%, I think, were those sort of intermediate routes, those in-breaking routes, the digs, the deep outs, the slants, right? That Kyle Pitts has had a lot of success running in the 3 years prior to Zac Robinson and Raheem Morris's arrival. That was a lot of what he was doing. You go back to Kyle Pitts' rookie season where he had this breakout 1,000-yard season, obviously his best year. It was kind of the reverse of that when you sort of group those routes, right? 22% this past year were digs, deep outs, and slants. Well, in 2021, that was 47%, very similar to the number he had of hitches, curls, and quick outs this past year, right? Goes, wheels, corners, posts were about 25%. So roughly the same in that 21 season as they were last year. 27% was that number. And then the hitches, curls, and quick outs went from 49% last year, but in his rookie season were 18%. And I'm not suggesting that the Falcons should go back to running the Arthur Smith offense. We talked at length last offseason about how unorthodox the Arthur Smith offense, again, zigging, zagging, that's what the Falcons do. Where we talked about how Pitts was mostly a vertical threat in Arthur Smith's offense, while the wide receivers were doing all the underneath stuff, while most teams, pretty much every other team in the NFL, uses their wide receivers to stretch defenses vertically and have the tight end eat underneath. I'm sorry. But I do feel like we could probably get more digs, more deep outs, more slants out of Kyle Pitts than what we are currently doing, because, I thought we would get more out of that, because a lot of those types of routes are what, the Vikings do with TJ Hawkinson in Minnesota, right? About 30% of TJ Hawkinson's 2023 targets were those digs, those deep outs, and those slants. About 34% this past year in 2024. And the reason why you often hear me compare Kyle Pitts to TJ Hawkinson is because TJ Hawkinson is a talented and featured tight end in a McVay derivative offense, which is what you hoped, or what I hoped we would see from Kyle Pitts last year in Zac Robinson's McVay derivative offense. And I could also use Cade Otton as an example, coming from Liam Cohen's offense, right? Where you saw when Mike Evans was out for that 3-game stretch last year, alongside Chris Godwin, who would miss, the latter half of the season, Cade Otton became the featured weapon in that Bucs offense, getting 10 plus targets in those 3 games that Evans was out, in addition to Godwin, including that Week 8 matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. And, to me, when you tell me like, oh, the reason why those guys are getting the ball is simply, which is often the excuse of why Kyle Pitts is not getting featured, is, well, Kyle Pitts doesn't want it enough. And the reason why Cade Otton and TJ Hawkinson are getting featured is because they just want it more. I don't think that's the case. Now, I know many of you are already yelling at your phone. You're already posting your comments before letting why didn't you talk about this, Aaron, in terms of why you blaming, the offense for all of Kyle Pitts' problems. And it's like, you're right. I don't think it's all on Zac Robinson or all on the quarterback. Kyle Pitts bears some responsibility for his shortcomings, right? That's why we have these nuanced conversations on this podcast. He absolutely has to be a better tight end, right? We've talked a lot over the last 6+ months about Kyle Pitts' consistency. I remember talking about this with Tanitra Batiste on one of the Locked On Falcons postcasts. I think it was a postcast, maybe it was an football party back during the season. I think it was probably after that Tampa Bay game, where it's like far too often we're getting one bozo play, to borrow the Luke Braun of Locked On Vikings parlance, from Kyle Pitts every single week. That bozo play being a drop, being a bad route, etc. And we need to get Kyle Pitts to eliminate those bozo plays, right? And I understand, because of the scrutiny that Kyle Pitts is on, from being a former 4th overall selection, a lot of people put even more emphasis on, like, we're not getting enough out of Kyle Pitts. But I sit here and I always got to stress this point, because I feel like a lot of the criticism directed at Kyle Pitts is based off of the draft pick. And I always say on this podcast, who cares about a draft pick, guys? Draft picks are just raffle tickets. That's all it is. It is a piece of paper with a number printed on it, and it determines the order in which you pick. It is no value. It has no inherent value to a draft pick, right? Once you turn in that ticket, that piece of paper becomes worth it. At that point in time, it's about winning games, right? And everybody focuses on, you got to live up to the pick. And it's like, who cares, man? Tell me how you help me win football games. And that's the reason why I'm talking about this in the ways that I'm talking about this, and why I focus so much on Zac Robinson, because I don't think he's doing enough, particularly with Kyle Pitts and this offense, to help you win football games, right? He's not challenging defenses, as I talked about earlier, in the ways that I think you should, right? And that's, part due to the usage of Kyle Pitts, whether we're talking about the route tree, whether we're talking about him being an afterthought, a check down option, all those various things, right? And when we talk about Zac Robinson on this podcast, we cannot go this long without talking about those 2 words, play action, right? And you just compared Kyle Pitts to TJ Hawkinson and Cade Otton, right? In 2023 and 2024, in a Sean McVay derivative offense under Kevin O'Connell, about 20% of TJ Hawkinson's targets were play action passes. You look at Cade Otton's, very similar number last year in Liam Cohen's offense, 19.5%, so roughly 20%. The previous year, it was 22%. Kyle Pitts in 2023 in Arthur Smith's offense, 22% of his targets the entire season were play action passes. What was that number last year? 5%. And that's, to me, the core of the issue when it comes to the Atlanta Falcons is like no one ever talks about the play action. And whenever people talk about the Falcons' poor play action, they just basically say, it was a Kirk Cousins problem. And it's just like, it would be so much easier, guys, if I could just brush off and just pass it off as a Kirk Cousins problem. But the reason why I don't do that, right, is because like we went into the bye week, right? We didn't spend that much time talking about the play action passing outside of the week 1 game, the Bruno game that we don't talk about that the Falcons had. But for the next 10 weeks, we didn't spend that much energy talking about play action because the Falcons offense was mostly getting by without it, right? Being bottom in the league in play action, and they were still finding ways to be able to move the football. It was like, okay. And then going into the bye week, Raheem Morris says, we're going to figure out the play action. And so I started paying a lot more attention to the play action coming out of the bye week because I'm like, hey, okay, Raheem says Zac is in the lab cooking up something. Let's see what he cooked up. And then what we got at the end of the season for those final 6 games, you know, what Zac was cooking up was the most unseasoned, overcooked piece of chicken breast I've ever seen, right? Zac, basically the guy that went down to the Publix, the Kroger, the Food Line, the Safeway, the Ralph's, the HEB, the Wegmans, the Giant Eagle, the Albertsons, the Piggly Wiggly, wherever the grocery store is where you live, guys, the Hy-Vee, right? He went down to his local grocery store. He went to the meat section, picked up a couple of pounds of chicken breast, took it home, took it out, straight from the package, threw it on the grill, threw it in the oven, threw it on the stove, threw it in the air fryer, whatever it is, no seasoning in sight. And then he forgot about the chicken and they overcooked, coming out dry AF, as the kids say, right? And it's the same thing, you know, whenever people talk about let Terry cook, man, you know, this man is out here with his unseasoned chicken as well. Anytime Terry's out here cooking. So I say, stop saying let Terry cook because that chicken don't taste good. And it's like, oh, well, Zac, it's the first time play call. You got to cut him some slack. And I'm like, I can't cut him some slack, guys. To continue the chicken metaphor, right? He came from Shea McVay, which was a restaurant. It is, you know, an offense, right? An offense that is world renowned for its ability to marry their play action, their run game to their passing game, aka play action. And Shea McVay is a restaurant that's world renowned for their chicken, their juicy, succulent chicken. He spent 5 years working at that restaurant and didn't learn a single thing. That's why I harp on it. That's why I don't sit here and cut him some slack as a first-time play caller, right? You know, like you work 5 years in the kitchen in Popeyes, you should be at least be able to make some decent fried chicken, my guys. You know what I'm saying? And so you're like, oh, well, you know, Kirk was the problem. And once Penix got in, the play action was fine. It's like, no, it wasn't, right? He put a little pinch of salt, a little pinch of pepper, right? I could count how many pepper flakes were on that chicken now once Penix came in the game, but that's still not enough pepper, right? It's still dry. It's still overcooked. It's still bland, right? Where's my garlic powder? Where's my onion powder? Where's my paprika? We got no herbs. We got no acid. We got no oil to marinate this chicken in. It's just dry, bland, tasteless, unseasoned AF chicken. And I want some good chicken. You guys know, you can look at me and tell me, like, I don't miss a meal when I'm served chicken. Okay. I'm the stereotype, right? I meet that stereotype when you put a piece of chicken in front of me. I just want some good chicken, you know, just some succulent, juicy chicken, baby. You know, that's all I'm asking for. And we didn't get that last year. And I'm hoping we get it this year. And I think Kyle Pitts can be a part of that, especially if they have an actual functional play action passing game. Maybe he could be part of that, you know, in addition to adjusting what he's utilizing. So that's how I kind of think about the Kyle Pitts conversation. Again, it's not all because it's all Zac Robinson's fault, but I'm just sitting here saying, like, we don't talk enough about this bland, dry chicken that this man was serving. And maybe I spend too much time focusing on the chicken because I'm me, right? Because I don't miss no meals when it comes to chicken, right? Maybe I'm too obsessed with the chicken. But at the same time, like, nobody else is talking about this chicken. And I'm looking around and I'm like, y'all enjoying this chicken? Like, I'm not enjoying this chicken. Are you enjoying this chicken? So let me know. Drop your chicken recipes in the comments below. Let's talk about the difference between thighs and breasts and wings and all that stuff, drums, all that stuff. So let's get it. Let's get it popping in the comments. Let me know, you know, do you think this chicken was tasting good? Do you think it's too dry? What are some of the ways? What's some seasonings? You know, what do you think is the equivalent of the onion powder that Zac is going to be sprinkling on that chicken this offseason? So we'll see on that front. But, you know, all I have to say, don't expect the Kyle Pitts trade to be imminent. And I'm hoping, I really do truly believe that, like, this offense is going to be DOA once again, as being a middle of the pack offense if they can't find ways to get Kyle Pitts more involved in this offense. And I think there are plenty of ways, and we'll continue talking about that as the summer goes on. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And for your second listen, make sure you check out the Locked On NFL Scouting Show with Joe Marino, Kyle Krabs. They're going to get you guys geared up as the season moves on, breaking down and making you the most informed fan each and every offseason. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your chicken every day.